Welcome to my studio, everyone. My name is Mark, and I'm an artist and an art professor, and in this lesson, I'm going to talk about what I think is the single most important rule of hatching. This is the first rule I teach to my students, and it applies to just about any type of hatching you wish to do, whether it's parallel hatching, cross-hatching, or cross-contour hatching. I'm also going to give you some important hatching tips related to this rule. Let's get started. Here is the rule. Keep the gauge of your hatching the same. This means that before I apply my hatching, I decide how far apart the hatch lines are going to be, and then I stay with it all the way through the drawing. So if the gauge in my drawing looks like this, then my next layer will keep the same gauge. The next layer the same. So on and so forth. This doesn't mean that my hatch lines can't vary. They can in length, they can in line thickness, they can in curvature. But the gauge, the distance separating the lines, needs to remain the same. This is important because hatching is an illusion where the eye is tricked into perceiving a series of closely spaced lines as value. So long as the gauge between the lines is consistent, the illusion is maintained. But once you start varying the lines, the hatching begins to draw attention to itself and the illusion fails. And instead of flat value, we instead see texture. It also interferes with your ability to control value and will make your drawing very messy looking, like it is here. Like most rules of cross-hatching, this is easier said than done, and one of the first exercises I recommend to the beginning cross-hatcher is simply to practice putting down consistent areas of hatch in every direction. Practice short lines, practice long lines, practice thin lines, practice thick lines, practice curvatures. Fill a few pages, and eventually you'll find yourself applying consistent hatching. The distance between your hatching can really be anything you want, from very closely spaced to medium spacing, to broad spacing. Though, if the lines are too widely spaced apart, the illusion of value does start to break down. In this next example, I'm going to do a hatch that is very closely spaced together. This requires a pen that puts down a very fine line, otherwise the hatching will be overly dense. Because the hatching is light, I need to put down many layers to get enough contrast, which is a good thing because it allows me to build up my values gradually, minimizing the risk that I'll go too dark. Furthermore, each individual hatch line is less prominent, lowering the chance that I'll weaken the drawing by choosing the wrong hatch angle or curve. These factors make narrow gauge hatching the easiest way to work, regardless of what specific hatching technique is utilized. This method is best suited for longer, more finished drawings where you want to take your time and add a lot of detail. It's also a good choice when you don't want the hatching to be a prominent feature in the drawing. This is an important consideration that I haven't touched on in my previous videos. In representational art, there is a relationship between the image and the materials and techniques used to make it, and an artist must decide whether this relationship is harmonious, tense, fractious, or downright tumultuous. For example, a painter can so carefully blend the brushstrokes that the viewer is left to wonder how the painting was made. Or a painter can build up the image with thick brushstrokes so that the viewer can't look past the fact that the image is made from paint. The later paintings of Rembrandt are a good example of a carefully managed tension between the materials and the image, where the eye is constantly forced to shift between the image and the wondrous dance of brushstrokes that created it. In the case of closely spaced hatching, the image-making method is reduced to a whisper, allowing the image to speak. This is something we see in the more highly finished etchings of Rembrandt, where the hatching gauge is so narrow and the lines so fine that they're barely visible. When the hatching gauge is set more widely, the lines can be thicker and stronger. This requires a more measured approach since it's easy to go too dark too quickly and make things harsh. One way to reduce this risk and retain a degree of softness is to use a lighter ink. In these examples, I'm actually using a dark gray ink, Noodler's Lexington Gray, rather than black, which allows me to build up my values more gradually, even though the lines here are pretty strong. I would say the wider the hatching gauge, the more careful you have to be with your hatching angles and curvatures, since an incorrect angle choice or curve can sabotage the sense of form you're trying to create. This method should be used when you wish to strike a balance between the medium and the message, meaning that you wish the viewer to spend as much time admiring the image as the way it was hatched. Since the distance between the lines is wider, you can also play with line variation, making the lines thicker to increase contrast, to emphasize details, or to simply be decorative and calligraphic. Because the hatching here is more prominent, it more effectively conveys three-dimensional form than narrow gauge hatching where the lines fuse together. This medium gauge is my usual go-to for most drawing purposes, from quick sketches to more finished work, though the gauge might be narrower or wider depending on technical considerations. If the pen is super juicy, or the paper isn't taking ink well, I might choose to set the gauge a little wider so that I don't need quite as many layers, avoiding those annoying pools of ink which can occur when the lines are too juicy. This type of hatching gauge is used in this etching by Rembrandt, which is slightly less finished than the previous etching I showed you, but through their more widely spaced hatching is more energetic, playful, and informal. Now let's space our hatching more widely. Any more, and unless I intend to only look at the drawing from a distance, I risk breaking the illusion, turning my drawing into a bunch of chicken scratches. I think this hatching type is the most challenging in that each line is very prominent and I have to slow down and be very deliberate here, lest I put down an incorrect line and sabotage the form. Again, one way of making this broad gauged hatching a little easier to work with is to use a lighter ink, allowing me to build up my values more gradually. While the previous two hatching gauges can be applied to a variety of hatching styles, form following or not, this broad gauge should only be done with cross-contour hatching, where the hatching is closely form following. Otherwise, the strong texture of the hatch marks will break whatever sense of three-dimensionality you're trying to create. While the previous two hatching gauges can be applied to a variety of hatching styles, form following or not, this broad gauge should only be done with cross-contour hatching, where the hatching is closely form following. Otherwise, the strong texture of the hatch marks will break whatever sense of three-dimensionality you're trying to create. That said, in the relationship between the image and the methods, the hatching here becomes the dominant party, so much so that the drawing can still be considered successful even if the forms don't entirely pop off the page. This is not the easiest hatch gauge, and not one I use all that often, but it is really fun to do, allowing you to show off your hatching skills. This will be great for those who really enjoy playing with line variation, though I'm avoiding it here to make for a fair comparison between the hatching gauges. Note that I gave no strict measurements for the spacing of narrow, medium, and broad gauge hatching in this tutorial, since this is relative to the size of the drawing. This particular etching is pretty small, so while the hatching gauge looks broad, if it was applied to a much larger drawing, it might appear finer. So it's up to you to decide exactly how fine the hatching needs to be based on the scale of the drawing. I hope you enjoyed this lesson, and if you'd like to learn more hatching rules and strategies, please purchase my downloadable class, The Fundamentals of Crosshatching, The 6 Basic Strokes, available on Vimeo. I also run a 3-hour online workshop covering this material for those who are interested in real-time instruction. Thanks for watching, and see you back in my messy studio very soon. Bye-bye.